The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow on a desolate countryside road. Crickets chirped in the surrounding fields, their rhythmic song broken only by the occasional hum of a distant vehicle. A rusty old car rumbled down the road, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Behind the wheel sat a man with a hardened expression, his brows furrowed in frustration. In the back seat, a mother dog sat quietly with her 3 puppies huddled close. Her once shiny coat was dull, and her eyes, filled with trust and loyalty, flickered with confusion as she glanced at the man. The puppies whimpered softly, their tiny bodies trembling with every jolt of the car over uneven ground. The man pulled over abruptly, the tires crunching against the gravel. He stepped out and opened the back door, muttering angrily under his breath. "I can't do this anymore. You're too much trouble," he grumbled, avoiding the dog's gaze. He reached in, grabbing an old frayed leash tied to the mother dog's collar, and yanked her out roughly. The puppies scrambled to follow, their small legs struggling to keep up. He dragged them to a large tree by the roadside, its skeletal branches reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. The man tied the leash tightly around the tree trunk, securing the dog and her puppies in place. The mother dog let out a soft whine, tugging gently against the leash, but the man ignored her. "Stay here," he spat, as though they could understand his cruel words. "I've got my own life to deal with. I don't have time for you." He wiped his hands on his jeans, turned away, and stomped back to his car without a backward glance. As he slammed the car door shut and started the engine, the mother dog barked, a low, desperate sound that echoed through the still night. Her puppies yelped, their cries fading into the distance as the car's taillights disappeared down the road. For a moment, all was silent again. The dog sat down, her ears drooping as she nuzzled her frightened puppies, trying to comfort them. The cold wind rustled the leaves above, and a pair of glowing eyes emerged from the bushes nearby, watching them intently. The night seemed to hold its breath, as though something unseen had just awakened. The man, oblivious to the strange stillness and the eyes that followed him, drove on, muttering about how he was finally free of the burden. Little did he know, the road ahead would lead him to a reckoning far beyond his understanding. The quiet night deepened as the man's car disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind a patch of darkness where the lone tree stood. The mother dog, tethered tightly to the rough bark, pulled at the leash with all her might. Her eyes darted between her 3 puppies, who huddled close to her trembling form, and the road that had swallowed their owner. The leash dug into her neck as she struggled, but the knot was too tight. She growled softly, more in frustration than aggression, before whimpering as her strength gave way. The puppies squeaked in response, their small tails wagging faintly, as if encouraging their mother not to give up. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of unfamiliar surroundings. The rustling leaves above seemed to whisper ominously, as though they bore witness to the cruelty of the night. From the bushes nearby, a pair of glowing eyes emerged, sharp and calculating. A fox stepped into the moonlight, its sleek body illuminated faintly as it sniffed the air. The mother dog's ears perked up. Instinct took over as she bared her teeth and let out a deep bark, her maternal instincts overriding her exhaustion. The fox hesitated, its yellow eyes locking with hers before it slinked back into the underbrush. For now, the immediate danger was gone, but she knew they were vulnerable. The puppies, unaware of the threat that had just passed, began to whimper louder, their tiny stomachs rumbling with hunger. One of them crawled toward the leash, pawing at it with its tiny claws as though trying to help its mother. She leaned down and licked the pup's head, a gentle reassurance amidst their shared despair. The night stretched on, each passing moment feeling like an eternity. The mother dog shifted uncomfortably, adjusting herself to shield her puppies from the biting wind. She continued pulling at the leash, her teeth gnawing at the coarse fabric, but it wouldn't give way. Suddenly, a soft rustle broke the silence. Her ears twitched, and she turned her head sharply toward the noise. Another pair of eyes gleamed from the shadows, this time larger and closer. The presence lingered, the air growing heavier with tension. The puppies began to cry louder, sensing their mother's unease. The glow of the eyes disappeared, but the feeling of being watched remained. Exhausted and desperate, the mother dog let out a low howl, a call for help that echoed into the emptiness around her. It was a gamble, a plea to the universe for a savior, even as she braced herself for the possibility of attracting more danger. As the first rays of dawn peeked over the horizon, the mother dog's strength waned, but her determination did not. Though her body trembled with fatigue, she stayed alert, her pups pressed against her warm belly for comfort. Somewhere in the distance, a faint sound reached her ears, a vehicle approaching, its tires crunching on the gravel road. Her heart raced with a mixture of fear and hope. Would this be salvation or another cruel twist of fate? The mother dog braced herself, her eyes fixed on the approaching headlights, ready to protect her young no matter what came next. The man gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale under the dim glow of the dashboard lights. He didn't look back, not even for a second. "They'll survive," he muttered to himself, as if saying it aloud could absolve him of the gnawing unease creeping into his chest. The road stretched ahead, barren and eerily quiet, illuminated only by his car's aging headlights. The hum of the engine was the only sound, a monotonous rhythm that failed to drown out the faint echoes of the mother dog's bark, still lingering in his mind. He shook his head sharply, trying to dispel the memory. They were just dogs, he rationalized, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. As he drove farther into the night, the road seemed to grow narrower, the tall trees on either side leaning in like silent witnesses. A dense fog began to roll in, thick and heavy, swallowing the road ahead. The man cursed under his breath and slowed the car, his visibility reduced to just a few feet. His unease deepened when the radio, which had been playing faint static, suddenly fell silent. He reached out to adjust the knob, but no sound came through, not even the comforting hum of static. He frowned and glanced at his phone, hoping for some distraction, but the screen showed no signal. A loud thud jolted him from his thoughts. The car swerved slightly as he slammed on the brakes, heart pounding. His breath came in shallow gasps as he scanned the road. Had he hit something? He squinted through the windshield but saw nothing. Probably a branch, he muttered, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. He stepped out cautiously, the cold night air biting against his skin. The fog wrapped around him like a living entity, muffling every sound. He checked the front of the car. No dents, no sign of impact. Yet, a strange unease lingered. As he got back into the car and turned the key, the engine sputtered but refused to start. "Come on," he growled, twisting the key again and again. The engine roared to life on the third attempt, but as he accelerated, the headlights flickered briefly, casting unsettling shadows on the foggy road. The road seemed unfamiliar now, though he was sure he hadn't taken any turns. The trees were denser, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The man shook his head, trying to suppress the growing feeling of dread. Suddenly, a faint sound reached his ears, a rhythmic thudding, like paws hitting the ground. It started softly but grew louder, keeping pace with his car. His grip on the wheel tightened as he peered into the fog, but he saw nothing. "Get a hold of yourself," he muttered, trying to dismiss it as his imagination. But then, a shape emerged from the corner of his eye, a fleeting shadow darting alongside the car. His heart leapt, and he pressed the gas pedal harder, the old car groaning in protest. The thudding stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence. He exhaled in relief, but the calm was short-lived. A loud, haunting howl pierced the air, echoing around him. It wasn't a normal dog's howl. There was something chilling, almost human about it. The man's hands began to shake. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something behind him, but the mirror reflected only the fog. He reached out to adjust it, and his breath hitched. His reflection wasn't alone. A pair of glowing eyes stared back at him from the back seat. He whipped around, but the seat was empty. Panic set in as he faced forward again, his mind racing. He had to keep driving, had to get away from whatever this was. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing against the car like a living thing. The headlights barely illuminated the road now, and the trees loomed closer, their shadows twisting unnaturally. The man's heart hammered in his chest as the howls returned, closer this time, accompanied by whispers he couldn't understand. "You abandoned us." The words were faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind that seeped into the car. The man screamed, slamming his foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, but the road stretched endlessly. No landmarks, no turnoffs, only the oppressive trees and fog. He was trapped, and deep down, he began to realize this wasn't just a road anymore. It was a reckoning. Sweat poured down his face as he gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. His thoughts raced, each one more desperate than the last. What had he done? The bark of the mother dog echoed in his ears, louder than ever, as if mocking his choices. The car suddenly skidded to a halt, the engine stalling once more. This time, it wouldn't start again. The man sat frozen, paralyzed by fear as the whispers and howls grew louder, surrounding him. Outside, faint shapes began to emerge from the fog. Glowing eyes, sharp teeth, and the unmistakable forms of dogs, advancing slowly, deliberately. The man's screams were swallowed by the night, leaving only the sounds of the fog and the haunting howls echoing in the empty road. The car's engine sputtered to a stop, plunging the man into an oppressive silence. His heart hammered in his chest as he turned the key again, but the engine refused to start. Panic set in, the cold realization dawning on him that he was alone in the middle of nowhere. The fog outside had grown unnaturally thick, swirling in patterns that defied the wind. Shapes seemed to shift within it, shadowy figures darting just beyond his vision. He squinted, trying to convince himself it was nothing more than his imagination, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. A faint sound broke the silence, barely audible at first. It was a low, guttural growl, almost like a dog's but deeper, more menacing. The man froze, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but all he could see was the fog pressing against the glass like a living thing. Suddenly, the growl turned into a loud bark, echoing unnaturally around him. The man flinched, his breath catching in his throat. He spun around to look at the back seat, but it was empty. The interior of the car felt colder, as if the air itself had been sucked out, leaving an unnatural chill. "You abandoned us." The voice was faint, yet unmistakable, whispered as though carried by the wind. The man whipped his head around, scanning his surroundings. His rational mind struggled to take control, convincing him it was nothing more than his imagination. But the voice came again, louder this time, and it was joined by another. "You left us to die." He fumbled with the door handle, his instincts screaming to escape the confines of the car. The door creaked open, and he stumbled out, the fog swallowing him instantly. The air outside was colder, heavier, and carried the unmistakable scent of damp earth and decay. The growling returned, this time closer, circling him. He turned frantically, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Shapes began to emerge from the fog, dogs, or at least something that resembled them. Their forms were distorted, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. The man staggered back, his legs trembling. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice breaking. His words carried no authority here, only fear. The ghostly dogs advanced slowly, their movements deliberate. They didn't bark or snarl anymore, only stared at him with eyes that seemed to pierce his soul. One of them stepped forward, a larger figure with a familiar silhouette. Its gaze was unrelenting, filled with something more than anger. "Why did you leave us?" The voice came again, but this time it wasn't disembodied. It came from the dog itself, its mouth moving in sync with the haunting words. The man fell to his knees, his mind reeling. I didn't mean to," he stammered, the words spilling out in desperation. "I couldn't take care of you anymore. I had no choice." The ghostly figures began to circle him, their glowing eyes never leaving his face. The fog thickened, enveloping him completely, and the whispers grew louder. "You didn't try," another voice accused, filled with sorrow and anger. The man's memories came flooding back, the mother dog wagging her tail when he first brought her home, the way she protected him when strangers came near, and the joy her puppies brought when they were born. He had dismissed it all, reducing their lives to mere inconveniences. "I'm sorry," he cried out, tears streaming down his face. "I was wrong." The figures paused, their forms flickering like a flame about to go out. For a moment, the air grew still, and hope flickered in the man's chest. But then, the largest dog, the mother, stepped closer. Her expression wasn't one of forgiveness. "Sorry doesn't change what you've done," she said, her voice echoing with a chilling finality. The dog surged forward, and the man screamed. The fog consumed him, and the world went dark. When the fog cleared, the road was empty. The man's car sat abandoned, its doors wide open. The air was silent, save for the soft cries of a passing wind. Farther down the road, a kind stranger spotted the mother dog and her puppies. They had somehow freed themselves and were waiting patiently by the roadside. The stranger stopped and opened the door, and the mother dog climbed in with her pups. The man was never seen again, but his story lingered in the whispers of the wind, a cautionary tale of cruelty and the reckoning that follows. The man returned home after abandoning the dog and her puppies, relieved to have finally rid himself of what he considered a burden. His small, dimly lit apartment felt quieter than usual, but he didn't notice. Tossing his keys onto the counter, he collapsed onto the couch, sinking into the cushions with a sigh. "It's done," he muttered to himself, trying to push aside the faint twinge of guilt gnawing at him. "They'll be fine out there. Dogs are survivors." But as he sat there, the room's stillness became unnerving. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen seemed louder, and the ticking of the clock on the wall echoed unnaturally. He shook his head, attributing his unease to exhaustion, and decided to sleep it off. That night, he awoke to a strange sound, a soft, repetitive scratching, faint but persistent. His eyes darted around the room, adjusting to the darkness. At first, he thought it was coming from outside, but as he sat up, the sound grew louder, as if it were right outside his bedroom door. He hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. "It's probably just the wind," he told himself, though he knew better. Gathering his courage, he swung his legs over the bed and crept to the door. The scratching stopped abruptly. He opened the door slowly, peering into the dimly lit hallway. Nothing. The apartment was empty, just as he had left it. With a shaky sigh, he turned back toward his bed, but froze. There, on the floor by his bed, were faint marks, scratch marks, as though claws had been raking against the wood. His breath caught, and a chill ran down his spine. The following days were no better. The strange occurrences grew more frequent and more disturbing. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, disappearing when he turned to look. The sound of paws padding across the floor echoed through the apartment at odd hours, but every time he checked, the place was empty. One night, as he sat at his kitchen table eating dinner, he heard a low growl behind him. His blood ran cold, and he spun around, but nothing was there. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound caught in his throat. When he turned back to his plate, his fork clattered to the ground. The food on his plate was gone, replaced by a tattered piece of the leash he had used to tie the dog to the tree. It was soaked and muddy, as though it had been dragged through the dirt. Sleep became impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he dreamed of the dog and her puppies. They were standing in the middle of a dark road, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The mother dog's gaze bore into his, filled with a mixture of sorrow and anger. "You abandoned us," her voice echoed in his mind, over and over, even after he woke up. One night, the haunting escalated. He was jolted awake by a deafening crash in the living room. His heart pounded as he stumbled out of bed, clutching a flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the chaos that had overtaken his apartment. Furniture was overturned, papers were scattered everywhere, and claw marks were etched deep into the walls. But the most chilling sight was the footprints. Wet paw prints led from the front door to his bedroom, stopping right where he had been sleeping. Terrified, he ran to the bathroom, locking the door behind him. His breaths came in short, panicked gasps as he tried to make sense of what was happening. The light flickered above him, casting eerie shadows on the tiled walls. Then he heard it, a soft whimper, followed by a bark. It was coming from inside the bathroom. "No," he whispered, backing against the wall. "This isn't real." The lights flickered violently before going out completely. In the darkness, the sound of paws grew louder, circling him, and a deep, guttural growl filled the room. The man screamed, but it was cut short as the growling ceased abruptly. When the lights flickered back on, the bathroom was empty. He was alone, or so he thought. By now, the man was a shadow of his former self. He avoided the apartment as much as possible, spending his days wandering aimlessly and his nights in fear. But no matter where he went, the haunting followed. One evening, as he walked down a busy street, he caught sight of a stray dog in the distance. It looked eerily familiar, thin, with a dull coat and sorrowful eyes. The man froze as the dog turned its gaze toward him, its eyes glowing faintly. The world around him seemed to blur. The sound of traffic faded, replaced by the familiar cries of the puppies. The dog took a step toward him, and he stumbled back, tripping over the curb and landing hard on the pavement. "You can't escape us," the voice echoed in his mind. The man was never the same after that. He became reclusive, constantly looking over his shoulder as if expecting the dogs to appear at any moment. His guilt consumed him, driving him to the brink of madness. One day, he returned to the roadside where he had abandoned the dog and her puppies, desperate to find them and make amends. But there was no sign of them, only the leash he had tied to the tree, frayed and lying in the dirt. As he picked it up, a cold wind swept through the air, carrying with it a faint whisper, "We'll always be with you." The man dropped the leash and ran, but the whisper followed him, a chilling reminder that some actions leave scars that can never be undone. The man couldn't take it anymore. The howls, the growls, the claw marks, they had driven him to the edge of madness. He hadn't slept properly in weeks, his eyes sunken and his hands trembling as if the weight of guilt was crushing his very soul. The haunting wasn't just in his home, it was in his mind, his dreams, his every waking moment. He knew there was no running from it. Sitting alone in his darkened apartment, he stared at the frayed leash he had retrieved from the roadside. The object had become a symbol of his guilt, a tether to his sins. He clenched it tightly in his hands, tears streaming down his face. "I can't keep living like this," he whispered. "I need to make it right, if I still can." Determined to undo the harm he had caused, the man set out to find the dog and her puppies. He drove to the desolate stretch of road where he had abandoned them, his heart pounding with equal parts hope and dread. The tree where he had tied the mother dog stood as a silent witness to his crime, its gnarled branches reaching out like accusing fingers. The ground beneath it was bare, no sign of the dog or her pups, but there were faint paw prints leading into the nearby woods. Gathering his courage, he followed the trail, each step weighed down by the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The woods were unnervingly silent, the air heavy with an otherworldly stillness. As he ventured deeper, he began to hear faint sounds, whimpers, barks, and the soft rustling of leaves. The noises grew louder, more distinct, until he stumbled upon a small clearing. There they were, the mother dog and her puppies, huddled together near the base of a tree. Their once glossy coats were matted and dirty, their frames thinner from days without proper care. The mother looked up as he approached, her eyes piercing into his soul. "I'm sorry," he choked out, dropping to his knees. His voice wavered, the weight of his guilt crashing down on him. "I was selfish, cruel. I left you here to suffer, and I have no excuse. Please, let me make this right." The mother dog didn't move. Her gaze was unreadable, a mixture of pain, anger, and something else, something almost human. The man reached out hesitantly, placing the leash on the ground before them, a gesture of surrender. "Please," he whispered. For a moment, the clearing seemed frozen in time. Then, the mother dog stood, her movements slow and deliberate. She approached the man, her eyes never leaving his. He flinched as she came close, expecting her to attack. But instead, she sniffed the leash and let out a low, mournful whimper. The puppies followed hesitantly, their small bodies trembling. They surrounded him, their innocent eyes staring at the man who had betrayed them. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, and a low growl rumbled through the clearing, not from the dogs, but from the very earth beneath them. The man looked around in panic as the fog began to rise, twisting into unnatural shapes. "You must choose," a disembodied voice echoed, deep and resonant. It was neither human nor animal, but something in between. The man froze. "Choose?" he stammered. "Choose what?" "Redemption, or doom." The mother dog stepped back, and the fog thickened, forming ghostly figures around him. They were the shapes of dogs, dozens of them, each one scarred, broken, abandoned. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, filled with sorrow and rage. "If you truly seek redemption," the voice continued, "prove it. Care for those you have wronged. Give them the love and protection you denied. Only then will you be free." The man looked at the mother dog and her puppies, his heart aching. He reached out, his hands trembling, and gently picked up one of the puppies. Its tiny body felt frail, but it didn't resist. He stroked its fur, tears streaming down his face. "I'll take care of you," he vowed. "All of you, I swear." The ghostly figures watched silently as he gathered the puppies and approached the mother. She hesitated, her gaze still wary, but when he extended his hand, she stepped forward and nuzzled it cautiously. The fog began to recede, the ghostly figures fading into the shadows. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, replaced by a faint warmth. The voice returned, softer this time. "Your path will not be easy, but you have chosen wisely. May you find peace in your penance." If the man had chosen to walk away, refusing to accept responsibility, the outcome would have been far darker. The ghostly figures would have surrounded him, their glowing eyes piercing into his soul. "You have chosen selfishness," the voice would have thundered. "Your cruelty will be repaid." The dogs would have descended upon him, their forms shifting from ghostly to tangible. His screams would have echoed through the woods, silenced only when the fog consumed him entirely. When the fog cleared, the clearing would be empty, no sign of the man, the dogs, or even his footprints. Only the faint echo of howls would remain, a chilling reminder of the price of his actions. The man, having chosen redemption, returned home with the dogs. He nursed them back to health, dedicating his time and energy to their care. Slowly, the haunting memories of his past began to fade, replaced by the warmth of the bond he had rebuilt with the animals he had wronged. Though the guilt never fully left him, he found solace in his new purpose. The dogs forgave him in their own quiet way, their trust returning little by little. And for the first time in years, the man slept peacefully, knowing he had finally taken the first step toward making things right. Months passed after the man's decision to care for the dog and her puppies. Life took on a new rhythm, one filled with purpose. He woke early to feed and walk them, spent his days ensuring their comfort, and even took them to a local vet to nurse them back to full health. The puppies grew stronger, their playful antics filling his once quiet apartment with life. The mother dog, though still wary, seemed to forgive him over time, offering moments of affection that felt like absolution. The man thought he had escaped the haunting that had tormented him, believing his dedication had brought closure. But the truth was far more sinister. One crisp evening, the man decided to take the dogs for a walk under the clear night sky. The full moon hung low, casting an ethereal glow over the streets. The air felt unusually still, but he chalked it up to the quiet of the neighborhood. As they walked, he noticed the dogs behaving strangely. The puppies, usually energetic, began to whimper and huddle close to him. The mother dog stopped abruptly, her ears perked and her gaze fixed on something in the distance. "What's wrong, girl?" the man asked, his voice tinged with unease. The dog let out a low growl, her eyes glowing faintly under the moonlight. He followed her gaze but saw nothing, just the empty street stretching into darkness. Then, the streetlights began to flicker. One by one, they went out, plunging the area into shadow. The man's heart raced as a chilling wind swept through the street, carrying with it a faint, familiar whisper. "You thought it was over." The man froze, his breath caught in his throat. The whisper grew louder, echoing in his ears, overlapping with itself until it became a cacophony. He turned in all directions, but there was no one there. The mother dog barked sharply, snapping him out of his daze. She tugged at the leash, pulling him toward an alleyway as if trying to lead him away. But the man hesitated. A shadow emerged from the darkness ahead. At first, it was shapeless, a shifting form that defied explanation. But as it grew closer, it took the shape of a massive dog, its eyes glowing like embers, and its mouth curled into a menacing snarl. The man stumbled backward, his mind reeling. "No, this can't be real," he whispered. The shadow dog growled, its voice distorted and guttural. "You think your acts of kindness erase what you've done? You abandoned us. You condemned us to suffering. Redemption was never an option." The man clutched the leash tightly, his knuckles white. "I've changed. I've done everything to make up for it. I took them in. I cared for them. Too little, too late," the shadow interrupted. As the shadow dog advanced, the man noticed something horrifying. The puppies, once cowering at his feet, began to change. Their bodies shimmered and distorted, growing darker until they resembled the same spectral figures that had haunted him before. Even the mother dog began to transform, her eyes glowing with an unearthly light and her teeth elongating into sharp fangs. The man's knees buckled as he realized the truth. The dogs he had cared for, the ones he had poured his heart into saving, weren't truly alive. They were never meant to be saved. This was never about forgiveness, the shadow dog growled, circling him. This was about judgment. The man dropped to the ground, pleading, "Please, I've tried. I've done everything I could to make it right." The shadow loomed over him, its presence suffocating. "You can't undo the past. You must pay the price." The man's vision blurred as the shadows enveloped him. He felt a searing pain in his chest, as though his heart was being ripped from his body. The last thing he saw was the glowing eyes of the dogs surrounding him, their gazes devoid of the affection he thought he had earned. When the shadows finally receded, the street was silent once more. The dogs were gone, along with the man. All that remained was the frayed leash lying in the middle of the road, soaked with dew under the pale moonlight. The next morning, a passerby noticed something strange near the alleyway. A faint set of paw prints, larger than any dog's, led away from the scene. On the wall nearby, scrawled in jagged letters that looked like claw marks, were the words, "Abandonment leaves scars that never heal." Though no one ever saw the man again, some say his cries can still be heard on quiet nights, carried by the wind as a reminder of the cost of betrayal.